I was driving down an old highway during a snowstorm in 2011, a road that wasn't used nearly as much anymore. I was heading toward the next town with my girlfriend at the time, and for most of the drive we were following an SUV ahead of us. We stayed behind them for quite a while until they suddenly came to a stop. I slowed down and moved around enough to get a better view of what had made them stop. There was a truck sitting in the middle of the road, with both the driver's and passenger's doors standing open. Two separate sets of footprints disappeared from the truck and led into the woods. At first I assumed someone might have gotten into trouble, so I got out of my car to see if anyone was injured or needed help. There were no obvious signs that the truck had broken down though, and nothing about it immediately explained why the occupants would simply leave it there. What caught my attention was how little snow had accumulated inside the truck. Considering how heavily it was snowing, the doors couldn't have been open for very long. I started thinking that whoever had been inside had only left recently, which made the footprints leading into the woods feel even more unusual. I began following one of the sets of tracks into the woods because I wanted to make sure nobody was hurt. I hadn't gotten very far when the driver of the SUV called me back. He told me that the truck had already been reported stolen and that highway patrol was supposedly on the way. Once I heard that, I decided there was no reason for me to involve myself any further, so I returned to my car and continued on my way. A day or so later, I learned what had actually happened to the truck's owner. He was a local man who had been missing for more than a week. Police eventually searched the woods near where the truck had been abandoned and found his body lying in a ditch. He had been recently killed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. That meant the person responsible had apparently taken him into the woods, killed him, and then left the area. The tracks I'd seen hadn't belonged to someone simply wandering away from a broken-down vehicle. They had been part of something much more serious, and I had been standing right beside it without knowing. I'm still grateful that I stopped following those tracks when I did. I never heard a gunshot that night, which makes me think the killing must have happened shortly before we arrived at the truck. Looking back, I can't help wondering what might have happened if I had continued farther into those woods without knowing who or what was out there. Back in the early 1990s, I worked for Domino's Pizza. I was an assistant manager, although employees still had to make deliveries when necessary. One night, shortly after 11, I was sent to deliver an order to a house in one of the middle-income neighborhoods we served. When I arrived, there wasn't a single light on at the house. Our policy was that if the porch light wasn't on, we were supposed to drive to a nearby payphone and call the number on the order. The rule was mainly there to protect drivers from robberies. I usually ignored it and went straight to the door anyway. But something about that particular house made me hesitate. I sat in my car for a minute before deciding to follow the procedure. I drove back 2 blocks to a payphone and called the number listed on the order. The line had been disconnected. I was supposed to wait a little while and make one more attempt, so I decided to do that rather than immediately return to the store. While I was standing there, I noticed a Pizza Hut drive-thru nearby. Seeing another delivery driver wasn't unusual, since the drivers from different restaurants often crossed paths while working. I made the second call, but the number was still disconnected. For some reason, instead of simply going back to the store as I normally should have, I decided to return to the house and see whether someone would answer the door. When I got back, I immediately noticed that the Pizza Hut delivery car was sitting in the driveway. I remember thinking that something about the situation wasn't right. I turned into the long driveway, which had tall evergreen trees or shrubs running along the left side. Almost immediately, I noticed something large lying on the ground beside the open driver's door of the Pizza Hut vehicle. I pulled in behind the car and realized the person on the ground was the driver. At first, I thought he might have suffered some kind of medical emergency, possibly a heart attack. I got out and hurried over because I wanted to see if there was anything I could do. As soon as I reached him, I realized how badly he had been injured. His skull had been struck so severely that I could actually see his brain. I immediately ran back to my car, locked the doors, and drove roughly 90 miles per hour for the 2 blocks back to the payphone. I called the police, then contacted my store and told them what had happened. I also had them contact Pizza Hut. I waited for the police to arrive before going back. Eventually, a detective came over and explained what they had discovered. In the bushes beside the driveway, they found a real estate sign. The electricity to the house had been shut off, and the house itself was completely empty. They also discovered 2 separate sets of footprints in the bushes. The detective believed someone had placed orders with both restaurants and then waited for whichever delivery driver arrived first. The plan appeared to be to rob that person. I had arrived before the Pizza Hut driver, but because I stayed inside my car instead of walking to the door, whoever was waiting had been forced to wait for someone else. That realization stayed with me. If I had done what I normally did and walked straight to the house, I could have been the person lying beside that driveway. For whatever reason, I had listened to that uneasy feeling and stayed in my car. After that night, I never knocked on a customer's door when the porch light was off unless I already knew the customer well. I was camping in my car while driving up to visit my family in Salt Lake. The trip should have taken around 11 hours with only a few stops, but I wasn't in any particular hurry. I was traveling alone, so I decided to take my time, stop for the scenery, and enjoy the drive. I was around 18 at the time and didn't have much money, so instead of paying for a hotel, I decided I would find somewhere secluded off the freeway and spend the night in my car. This happened about an hour past the racetrack outside Las Vegas, on one of those exits where the roads seemed to lead mostly toward farms and open desert. I figured I probably wasn't on anyone's property, and even if I was nearby, I assumed nobody would be coming out there to check on me. I pulled off the road, parked, and sat on my tailgate eating dinner. I had some beef jerky and an Arizona tea while listening to music. Everything felt completely ordinary. Then, without warning, a motorcycle came flying past me. It had no lights on and was moving fast enough that it took me several seconds to fully process what I had just seen. I laughed to myself and shook my head, figuring the rider was simply taking advantage of the empty roads and wasn't too concerned about safety. Less than a minute later, 2 low-flying jets passed overhead. They were moving through the landscape in a way that reminded me of something from a military movie, curving around the mountains and moving through the valleys. Despite the strange motorcycle encounter, it was actually an impressive sight. About 10 minutes after that, I heard something else approaching. A convoy was coming down the road. I could hear the vehicles before I could see their lights, and as they got closer, I realized they were military vehicles. I had grown up around the military, so seeing a convoy wasn't unusual for me. Normally, if I saw one passing on a road, I would simply wave and let them continue. But this was nearly midnight, and, after the motorcycle and the jets, something about the whole sequence made me uncomfortable. I had the sudden feeling that I should turn around and act as though I hadn't noticed anything. Instead, I stayed where I was. A Humvee pulled up and positioned itself in a way that basically blocked my vehicle from moving. I could hear the doors opening, but nobody came over to speak to me. At that point, I was leaning against the hood of my car with the engine off. I didn't turn around to look at them. I kept my hands where they could be seen and tried to remain completely still. I could feel that someone was watching me. After a moment, the convoy continued down the road. The Humvee moved out of my way and followed the others. Nobody confronted me, questioned me, or did anything else. They simply continued on their route. Looking back, I think it really was just the strange combination of events that made the situation feel so unsettling. The jets were probably conducting training since there was an Air Force base nearby. The motorcycle rider was likely just someone taking advantage of an empty stretch of road, and the military convoy was probably doing routine training of its own. But at the time, sitting alone in the desert late at night, having all three things happen, one after another, felt very different.